Well, welcome to the Win, Make, Give podcast. Chad Hyams here, Bob Stewart. Wait a minute, Bob. You're not in your normal there spot, and I'm a little annoyed where I'm finding you.
I'm sitting in your seat here in the podcast studio, Chad.
Bob, that's
I got Dave on my left right here. That he's waving at us, the audio video guy that makes it all come to life. Like, I'm literally in your seat. I'm so thrilled with myself. I can't even stand it.
Here I thought when I moved east that area would be like, roped off as like like behind the road, like to see this is where Chad sat once. But no, you just moved in.
Here, it actually is roped off. Dave's gear is all over this table, Chad. I had to clear out a little hole in the table. There's audio video gear all over this table.
All right. So, Dave, thanks for turning my space into another storage table for you. You didn't need any more space. When I see you next, Dave, we'll have conversation about it. But, Bob, it's exciting because season 4 is here, and I can't believe we're in season 4 of the Win, Make, Give podcast. And we've got a few episodes already, but I'm still in shock that we made it to season 4.
I'm in shock people keep listening, Chad. So let's you know what, though?
Are you sure they are?
No, I'm not sure. Well, I don't know. Dave keeps telling us that people keep downloading the thing. He could be totally bullshitting us just to keep that job, that little, like that little extra hour of work or 2 hours or 3 or however many he does every week for us. I think though if that was really the case, I think he would tell us, because then he could not have to do this anymore and do the million other things Ben asks him to do every day. So I think people are still listening, Chad.
All right. Well, then let's get to it. Yes. Okay. If they're out there listening,
let's do it.
All right, let's bring on to our call today's guest. David Buckmaster is joining us here. And Bob, I'm going to tell you, usually I do this legwork. I find people, or people are coming to me saying we want to be on the show. This is a big shout out to Laura, who does our copyright work for us in the background, writes the descriptions of the episodes, helps us with the newsletter each week. She messaged me one day and said, "Get this guy on the show." I was like, "I don't know who he is." She says, "Just get him on the show." So I'm as in the dark as you are about the exciting things we've got going on. But David, welcome to Win, Make, Give.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the reference, and I might have to set a higher bar than I assumed. So we'll start there, see how it goes.
Well, I think by the end of this episode, you might be somebody who gets a book that ends up on my shelf and some information you're going to share with us. David, I don't like to read bios. Everybody knows it. Our guests don't know it. Our audience knows it. I don't like to read bios. So I'm going to put the hot seat on you. Describe yourself, introduce yourself, tell everybody who we're going to hear from today.
Sure. My name's David. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, originally from Florida, though. I have kind of a unique job. My job is to be that person who figures out how much money you make in your company. So we're usually tucked away into the back of the HR department. People don't tend to know that we exist. And sometimes we like that because people have very strong, passionate feelings about their pay. So I currently work for one of the big generative AI companies. In my past, I've worked for companies that everybody knows, for Nike, for Starbucks, doing compensation design and leadership for them. So now I'm in startup life. So it's a whole thing. But I'm here today representing my book, Fair Pay. It came out a couple of years ago, actually. And the goal of the book is just to help people understand how their paycheck is set, where I think some of these things are broken, and how we can make the overall process work a bit better.
Interesting. Have you heard of the company PayScale, David?
I know PayScale. Yeah, I have. Yeah, I have done events with PayScale. Have been a client of theirs at past companies. I know them well. I think they're based in Seattle, right?
Yeah. My wife was one of their sales folks for a few years back. So I have a little bit of exposure to kind of that comp software and all of this idea of employees trying to, like, companies trying to hire people, bring them in, pay them what they should be getting paid, right? There's so much here to unpack. Holy cow. So let me just start where Chad and I, that we joke here often, David, that most of these podcasts are like for our own benefit, and we're just hopeful that the audience gets something out of it. But I want to raise. What do I do?
Well,
going right to it, right, Bob? Going right to it.
Yeah.
Bang.
Honestly, same. I like these podcasts just because I work remote, and it's nice to just have a more casual conversation without, most of my day looks like people calling me saying, "David, I'm upset about something you're doing to my pay." So it's nice to have a more friendly conversation. So I appreciate that. But this is just a daily occurrence for people in a role like mine. And people say, "David, I want to raise." Usually it's come through their manager, or maybe they've got like a counter offer in their hand or something, and you need to respond, of course. And you have to take this stuff seriously, at every time, because you don't want to lose good people. You don't want to lose people who might feel that they are underpaid or paid unfairly. And so I think it's important that you always have empathy for somebody who is honestly taking a risk to come talk to you about this, because like nobody likes to talk to their HR department. Like, I get it, we're not super popular, and especially the comp person is usually like, and a lot of companies are not like the most empathetic, like fun person to talk to, because they're like Excel junkies and that's all they do. So I try and take that approach to say, okay, let's just have a conversation about how you feel you're being paid. And usually that starts with, let's talk about your role in the company. If the company has, a leveling matrix or a career guide or something, let's first make sure that we're talking about this in the same terms. Do we agree that what you think you're doing is equivalent to what we think you're doing? Because sometimes, like if you're in big companies, there could easily be a mismatch here. I've worked for companies with 100,000 plus people on the roster. I don't know if somebody's role has changed significantly, and sometimes they may just have to reach out to somebody like me and let's have a conversation about it. If it's clear there's something wrong, like either this person is paid, below the minimum of their pay range that the company has set, or they're performing work that is, at a few clicks up from how we've sort of leveled their job in the company, then yeah, I mean, these kinds of conversations are quite easy. Where it gets a bit harder is if somebody has said, hey, like they just have a total misunderstanding of what the company thinks they're doing versus what they're doing, and they might think that they are, maybe they're a very large personality, and they think, well, they're worth a lot more than they are, to put it bluntly, right? And so I say, well, that might be the case at another company where you take on a more expanded role. Here's how pay works at our company. Here's what we've chosen to do. And sometimes, like, paying people appropriately and fairly, like, you have to say no sometimes, because like what you don't want is an ecosystem in your company where the loudest complainers get the most money. That's not going to set anybody up for success, because the truth is everybody wants more pay. Like, that's just like a normal thing. And so if you can set the right standards, help people understand where they find themselves in that placement, how the process works, then typically you can, at the very worst, sort of agree to disagree and then move on. Sometimes you lose people, and that might be the necessary result, because they might want a huge job that the company just can't support for whatever reason. So it's highly contextual based on the person's situation is the answer to that question.
And this is why Bob's not getting a raise, because we don't want the loudest complainers, right, to be the ones getting paid the most. So, David, we did something last season, in the middle of season 3. Many of our audience members went through it, which was the Wealth series. And folks, David sounds like, the perfect complement follow-up to that Increase Your Income episode, because we talk about a lot of these things. And in your book, David, you talk about how to get a raise, close the wage gap, and build stronger businesses. So while many people want to raise, a lot of our audience are entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And they're working in an industry that is commission-based or sales-based in that sense. They're not getting raises other than go work harder, right? Go sell more. That's going to be that opportunity when it comes to a raise. But you do talk about how they can build stronger businesses. And while Bob's going to keep going back to this raise thing because he really wants one. I mean, Bob and I both get paid the same to do this podcast, which is nothing.
I'm looking for a raise on zero. Like, where do you start there, David?
100 times. I'm going to 100 times your salary.
Yeah.
All right.
I have no authority in your company, but I can get you a raise on zero. We can manage that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'll send Bob $1 every year and say
see if there's any change under your desk here, Chad, from when you were.
Wait a minute, get out of there. All right, I'm hiding things down there. Let's talk about it more in my perspective. And again, from that building stronger businesses of understanding fair pay, because they might be entrepreneurs, yet they're going to have people they're paying. So let's put the hat on the boss, not necessarily the employee in this situation. Talk to us with that angle, with this getting a raise and closing the wage gap thing, which we all know is an issue.
Yeah, maybe we come back to the wage gap part because I think that warrants its own conversation. But like from the boss perspective, uh, this is a really complex topic, but it's super important. So I may have created a bit of a branding problem for my publisher because I'm trying to approach the book from all of these angles at once. It's not just the hey, how do I get a raise for myself, but it's also there's a whole section of the book. Hey, how do you actually afford this as a business owner? Why is it actually the right thing to do? And if you look at my history, so I've spent a lot of my career working with companies that have a huge volume of their people in retail environments, manufacturing, jobs that are not traditionally or at least now not very well paid, right? In restaurants and that kind of thing. Broadly, what I found is that people will always carry the burdens of whatever they're going through in their life into work. If somebody is not able to make the basic ends meet on their on their daily life, like they can't they can't take a day off. If they get sick, they've got to go to work. If they can't better themselves because they have no time or they can't afford schooling. They can't go to the doctor. Like all of this stuff shows up at your place of work the next day, right? So you've got sicker people who are less engaged, people who are quitting and willing to take a job for $1 more an hour because they have to. Those kinds of things, you can largely get ahead of some of those problems if you just say, you know what, are we treating everybody in the company from the bottom of the wage scale to the top of the wage scale? Are we not necessarily paying them the same, of course, but taking their life seriously? Are we wondering, are we giving dignity to everybody who works for me? As a business leader, as a CEO, I feel that you have a responsibility to know what does the lowest person in your company make? Should it be that low? Have you just said that it is just, well, this is the whim of the market and the market's magically going to take care of it? One of the core arguments of my book is that it's not really how most companies are setting wage policy. Like you have a lot more agency as a business leader to do this than you probably think that you do. And because a lot of my experience has been on sort of that low wage spectrum, like you typically haven't really seen a lot of sort of market driven wage increases, with the exception of increases that resulted from a series of minimum wage increases in the US that happened starting 2014, 2015. Then you started to see some movement there, right? You saw more movement post COVID when it was harder to hire, but like there's a lot more going on here. It's like there's a section called supply and demand and all the other stuff in the book. There's a lot more structural pieces than I think most people realize. And so just leaving it up to this, let's let the market sort it out, you're missing a lot of the story here. Now, you mentioned sales. Sales is a really unique thing, right? So you're right. Sales pretty straightforward. Hey, you're making maybe a draw where you've got a base salary or maybe a commission. If you don't quite earn your commission, maybe you're not staying with this company anymore. But if you out earn it, then this is sort of I don't really like this phrase, but you kill what you eat is sort of what you hear, or you eat what you kill, I guess is the right order of that. And so like there's a much more direct, what we call line of sight to say, well, if you perform, you get paid this. And I think that is like in a lot of environments that can work great, but I think, and not most people's jobs aren't that, they're teachers, or they are, police officers, or they are working in a retail environment, or they've got a desk job somewhere. So I think you have to, again, contextualize what's the kind of job. Does this person have opportunity to better themselves, or are there potentially some structural things sitting on top of that are sort of limiting their ability to grow and to achieve their potential? So I think taking that whole 360 view of, is this person's job affording them the opportunity to better themselves so they can choose to go down that path, I think that's where you have to start. And I think when you take with that mentality, sort of all the stuff that quickly gets into politics and legislation, all that sort of melts away, and you start to say, okay, does this person have growth opportunity or not? And then wage policy could sort of follow from there.
Can have you, is it Gravity Payments? Was that the company up here in Seattle where the CEO took that massive pay
Yes.
cut and like basically guaranteed every was it 75,000 or something? Like what do you think of that, being somebody that's kind of in that industry? That was kind of a big deal, right? And I'm not sure how the story's ended but what do you think of something of that nature? Yeah.
So I wrote about this
David,
in the book.
not everybody knows this story. So let's start with give us a little base and then take it through there.
Yeah, so there was a guy. There's a guy named Dan Price. I've got his book up on my shelf actually, so I was looking at his last name. And let me just say up front, this story is fairly controversial because I think there's some controversy about the CEO that I don't know if is true or not based
With
on
him
some personal
specifically,
life
that
stuff.
was, yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So let's separate out that from what actually happened with the company, right? So Dan ran, or I don't know if he still runs or not, but he has this company called Gravity Payments that he founded. And the story is that I think he was like on a team retreat or hiking with some people on his, in his company, and he found out that one of his customer service reps had a second job at McDonald's, and he's like, "Why are you working at McDonald's?" And the answer was, "Because I live in Seattle. You don't pay me enough to live here." And so that sort of shocked him to his core and saying, "What am I doing?" So he took all of the, everybody in the company and said, "We're going to have a company minimum wage." And it was $70,000 in Seattle. I think they later introduced one at like 60,000 for like Boise, so like a lower cost of living area. But then he increased everybody's wage up to 70. And like the guy is a really, like, he's a self promoter for sure. So he was on the cover of like every magazine. I think it was like Forbes or Fortune that put him on the cover that said, "Is this America's greatest boss?" That kind of thing. And so, personal characteristics aside for that guy, if you look at the back of his book, he sort of talks about what happened as a result of that. And, basically their turnover was, effectively zero. Their revenue spiked, their profit spiked, people were more engaged, they took less sick days, because they actually had some margin in their life to take care of themselves. And so I think, whether you like it or not, people bring their everything about themselves in their life into their workday. They can't just separate it out and say, from 8 to 5 or whatever, I'm going to be this accountant. And then all the other stuff swirling in the back of my mind around my health and wellness and family, that starts at 5:01. That's just not how it works. And so he said, if I can solve this immediate, sort of cash problem for them, they can start to solve some of the other problems. And then that more integrated, more healthy overall lifestyle will theoretically ripple through my business. And honestly, that's what he found. And like the core of this was that it was based on this study that basically says, your happiness is a measure. Like, you can't buy happiness, but you kind of can. Like but you have to be making at least like $70,000 a year, because anything below that, at least at the time of the study, was basically putting you in a position of precariousness of some kind, and so you can't like build a family or whatever. Now, wages below that may be perfectly appropriate for lots of reasons, students or people who are entry levels or whatever. But that was sort of what they found in the research study, that there's a sort of wall that you can break through at a certain income level that honestly life just gets a lot easier for you. And so that was what it was based on, and seemed like it was pretty successful. Now, I think the counterpoint might be that, hey, as a tech company, you probably don't have that many people who are making less than 70,000 anyway. So could Starbucks do this tomorrow? I work on the Starbucks comp team. Like, I could calculate back at the envelope what that would cost them, and I'm pretty certain they couldn't do it, right? So like, there is a again, this all goes back to the context of the business and what you're trying to and what you need to achieve.
Okay, so
why
let me ask you.
Well, hold on, Chad.
Go ahead, Bob.
Sorry. Why do you think, like, he got all this press, seemingly, 2 years later, 3 years later, we look back and the company had all these benefits. Why didn't this take off? Like, what? And again, if I get a company like Starbucks can't do it, or maybe a Walmart can't do it, although maybe we could debate, how many billions of dollars those companies put into their stockholder or their shareholders' pockets. But if the case is being made that like the business is actually more efficient, effective, less turnover, in theory, more profitable, why doesn't this take off? Like, why haven't we seen somebody copying this? Or maybe we have.
I give you a couple of theories. So one, this curiosity right here is like the reason that I wrote this book. So like, I spent a lot of years in working on low wage comp, just banging my head against the wall. Like, why can't I get senior leaders to sort of understand this? Again, it's not meant to go to $70,000 an hour, but why can't you get them to go from 11 to 15 or whatever it may be? And like, my answer to this is that the further away you are from the top, and I'll just be really blunt, the harder it is to get a pay increase in your company, because like there's enough distance between you and the CEO where they just don't. I don't want to say they don't care, but they don't know. They're so removed from what's actually going on. Like, even at major companies, like massive companies, the head of HR probably doesn't actually know how the comp program works. Like, I've seen enough to know that that's true in a lot of places. And so what is the data? Like, how are we're just assuming that somebody in the comp team, what I do, has figured this out. And if turnover is staying at a normal market benchmark rate, then everything is fine. But it's not from a societal level, right? But to your point around why has this not taken off? I think it kind of has, but I think the characteristics of the story are also really unique. This is a small company focused on tech. Like the reality, I don't know their financials, but like if you are doing customer service reps from 40 to 70,000, which is my guess as to what they were, this probably wasn't like an existential P&L problem for the company. Like
it was like
all
10
their software
people that
engineers,
yeah.
probably right. Like their software engineers in Seattle surely were over this rate already. You know, their anybody manager and above was surely over this rate already. But like when you think about like let's go back to sort of the retail example. If you've got like, I am with you, by the way, like if you're doing share repurchases and you're returning money to shareholders, I wrote a lot about that in the book. But the company also has to show what is the core operating margin of the business at the restaurant level or at the retail store level or at the manufacturing facility level, in which case they don't get to play with that big pool of money. Like the smaller you cut this thing down, it says, okay, so my labor costs are to run this store are whatever, $400,000 a year, and this store is pulling in, $1 million a year. If I increase my labor costs to 600,000, now I've got to go on my earnings call and say, hey, our unit margins are now off by some massive percent, and that's going to be a problem. So a lot of this is framing. Like, could Target tomorrow say, hey, we're going to dedicate $1 billion to wages? Yeah, absolutely they could. They could find the money. But when it gets down to that sort of unit economics, they're going to have a problem in how they message that. And the reality is they also don't have to, like there's no, this is why I think the minimum wage law has actually pushed up a lot of the sort of hourly wages, because companies basically had all the power in this. We all look at the same sets of market data. We all look at and we just assume, yeah, this is right. This is what everybody else is paying. But it's the way I describe in the book is like, it's kind of a three-legged race. We're all sort of tied together, looking at the same market data. We know that if you leave Burger King and go to McDonald's, you can go to Wendy's or whatever, and it's all going to be roughly the same. But I think what I've been trying to get after is like, how do you create an environment such that companies have to compete for employees at the same pace they have to compete for customers? And I think that's a really hard problem, because there's a lot of friction and frankly a lot of lack of transparency in how compensation works in most places that create a lot of the challenges here. So it's a complex topic. Yeah.
A company like PayScale, I mean, that's kind of their mission, is to set out to allow the employees to feel comfortable with what they're making, because they can see that that's what people in their similar role in a different company might be making, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you know what? Like, if you sort of take this parallel up to the executive compensation rank, which is its own, controversial area, we can learn some lessons there. If you are a big public company, all of their compensation is public. I can look up any public company in the world right now, look at their proxy statement, and tell you what the top 5 people make. And so do we think that has had a depressing effect on wages or an acceleration effect on wages? And the reality is, when you're transparent with it, it increases wages for people, right? Like if this works at the top of the organization, conceptually, it should be working at the bottom of the organization too, right? But that stuff is sort of hidden away. So you're right. There's a lot of companies that are trying to tackle this right now. PayScale is doing a nice job, but I think they're primarily focused on more like professional level roles. My friend Diana runs a company called Upwage that is trying to tackle this from a more frontline, retail restaurant level focus, to basically aggregate all that data and make it available. So you can look at something like a Google map and say, well, here's the 10 jobs in my area. I know right away what they're paying. So it's a time of rapid change for the field, and I think it's long overdue.
David, I want to give you the magic wand that you can solve everything. Okay. So and here's the challenge. We are getting to a point with inflation and everything that's happened that we're making life really difficult for a lot of people, because it costs so much for stuff, but we haven't seen the wage increases in the same way. How do we solve the problem that's out there for people that aren't making whatever that magic number is that says once you're over 70, 75, whatever it is, that life seems to be a little easier? Is there a way to solve that problem?
By the way, this is like your first attempt at becoming president, David. Like, if you can answer this question, we're going to run you for president in 2024, bud. So no pressure.
Nobody wants that, I promise. And I'm going to
Wait, to
disappoint
be
you.
president or to run you for president? Which
No, I don't. I couldn't make those. I couldn't take that 3 a.m. phone call. I like to sleep too much for sure. That's not that's not something I could manage. I think I wish I had the great macro and microeconomic solution for this, right? But I think and it's really hard to touch on this without veering into the world of politics, I suppose, too, or and taxation and how it works and all those kinds of things. But I think what I try to focus on is how do companies make pay decisions, and have we questioned those assumptions in a long time? So I know that if I buy the standard market survey data and I say, okay, so software engineers or the fry cook, is paid this, like, have I really thought about what goes into that data? And is that should I, as a comp person, be the only person who has access to that proprietary information? And I think forever the answer has been, yeah, we trust this data. It's the only data that matters. And of course, the comp person, they paid for the data. They should have information asymmetry to where they should be able to access data that other people can't get. But I think the long term output of that is that it's created all sorts of challenges. I think where things are headed around some of the transparency, if we allow people to have, if we create more avenues for employment mobility, meaning it's easier for people to take a job that is higher paying because, one, they know that it's higher paying. Two, they're not stuck on some sort of non-compete kind of agreement that doesn't allow them to go down the street. There are one of the reasons that I think wages have spiked in California is because they don't have non-compete agreements, right? Like I think this is something that or they're not enforceable, at least. You might need them for certain knowledge worker fields, right? But like, it doesn't make sense that the Wendy's chicken sandwich cook can't go to the McDonald's around the corner. So if you allow people more opportunity and more information, I do tend to believe that markets can work. But I think this information asymmetry has been so slanted towards the employer that it's created a lot of distortions in the market. So beyond that, I think you have to look at things like, yeah.
Tech becomes potentially an equalizer in this arena, right?
It absolutely is, and I think we've seen it. I mean, there's so much like money and money coming into this, like companies like PayScale and Upwage. I'm an advisor to a company doing similar things in Brazil. So it is. There's a lot of energy. Pave is another great one. Equity, like there's a lot of companies that are trying to tackle this issue right now to give people accurate information. And so, like historically. If you look 5-10 years ago, some of this data, like if you saw on Glassdoor or other places where it's self-reported, just frankly wasn't very good. It wasn't solid. So comp people didn't take it very seriously. It was sort of the same effect of if you read the Yelp review, and you might look at it and it's like, well, these are like maybe not great. Like maybe someone gave it a 1-star review because they wanted their steak well done. It's like, well, the chef knows that's not how the steak should be cooked. You're just wrong about this, So like, there's there's sort of a discrepancy between is the data to start with good, and then does the corporation, the comp person in my chair, do they take it seriously because they know that we're talking about good data here, right? And so I think again, greater access to information, greater talent mobility, longer term, figuring out things that are huge albatrosses around people, like healthcare is like healthcare. If you're on the low end of the wage scale, you've basically been atomized to where you're not getting healthcare. You either are working, a gig work where you definitely don't have it, or you're working, your fast food job or whatever is keeping you below, a certain hours threshold, so you don't have to provide health insurance. But this stuff is expensive for everybody. If, half the, or whatever, 20-30% of the country doesn't have adequate health insurance and they end up in the emergency room, that then flows into the cost structure for everybody else. A lot of people are getting pay raises that are sort of hidden. If I say, okay, my compensation increased by 3% this year, whatever it may be, 4%, 5%. But what I don't know is that, 10% of my income, or if you're maybe 20-30% of my income, actually increased by 20% to the company because of their healthcare renewal. But I'm not seeing that. I'm just noticing that, I still have healthcare like I did before. But the overall bill going to the company, your wage is actually being split into multiple areas, right? But you might not see all of it. And it might not actually affect your life. You might just continue to have something you had before, but those things are still getting more expensive. So I think there are some massive structural challenges, but I think those are a bit over my head, though I did try to tackle them. What I'm trying to do is help companies better assess the assumptions they're making and how they are setting compensation policy in their own companies.
All right. So, folks, the book's called Fair Play. The easiest place to get it is davidbuckmasterbooks.com. And we will put that in the show notes for you. So you've got it. David Buckmaster, it's his name, David Buckmaster Books, plural.com. You'll find Fair Pay there for you if you want to be checking this out. David, one, we are going to definitely run you for president after that, hearing about healthcare issues being too expensive and that steak should never be cooked well done. You definitely have my vote already. Here's the thing. I'm tentative to ask this question of you because I know, one, the solution sounds really simple, yet at the same time, for some reason, it's not. And I know I get really annoyed when topics like this come up, and I don't want to get angry at anybody. And that's this wage gap, right? That you talk about. I don't understand that. And I went off on some podcast last year or the year before with an interview. So, oh my God, I don't comprehend that people look at people and say, well, you're different, so I have to pay you different, or I'm going to be able to get away doing it. I don't want to. Okay, but talk about this wage gap thing and what each of us can possibly do to maybe add up to moving in the direction of a solution for this.
Oh, you'll have to send me that link, by the way. I'm curious to hear your reaction to it. So let's start with definitions, because I think this is like people sort of get this wrong at step one. Okay. And so when we say wage gap, when we say, and I talk a lot about this in the book, there are really two different definitions that I think people have interchangeably assumed are the same. And I think, honestly, some people do it on purpose because they just don't want to touch the issue, right? I'm not saying you're doing that, but I think there are some personalities and various media sources that might be okay with mixing up what they know better. So when we say wage gap, like, the math is just different than than how companies typically will run these analyses. So let me explain both. Wage gap is typically just like, let me just take the raw average of, let's say, men versus the raw average of women, right? Not controlling for any variable whatsoever. That's where you start hearing, women make, whatever, 72 cents on the dollar for men. Certainly, minorities might make a little bit more or less than that. Like that is its own kind of problem, right? Because what that means is that, okay, so we probably have some representation issues in leadership, right? It means that, okay, so if, of your top 20 spots in the organization, if, 17 of them are, of a particular, racial and gender makeup, that's naturally going to throw off the skew. And so I think companies have to, ask questions that say, hey, why is this? What's going on in our talent pipeline that everybody sort of is of the same, ilk or same background or whatever it may be. You could apply this to neurodiversity. You could apply this to, did they go to elite colleges? You could look at this at 1,000 different ways. I don't necessarily mean, that it's just this is a white guy problem. This is just a problem in corporate America. The other calculation is how companies tend to run this, which is called pay equity. And so what that is sort of controlling for companies will take, here's a list of variables that we consider acceptable for pay differences. And so those acceptable pay differences may be performance rating. They may be your job level in the company. Maybe location. If you pay more for people in San Francisco than you might in Nashville, for example. So the company will take their pay roster, they'll apply these differences, and then they'll typically run like a regression analysis to say, okay, we've controlled for the entire list of things that we think are acceptable. Now let's sort of run the regression and say, do any of these variables, do we still have a difference? And do any of these variables pop for things that we don't consider acceptable? So we don't consider differences in pay after controlling for the acceptable variables on gender or on race or on any other metric to be acceptable. But if that variable pops and you have nothing else to explain it, based on your list of variables that you think are acceptable, then the company might say, well, listen, we're not saying, like, we can't prove that there's any discrimination happening here, but we have nothing to explain to the person why they're paid differently. They're in the same job, same performance rating, same location, same, experience level, whatever. But for some reason, we found that they're paid $5,000 less a year than the other person. Most companies, when they go through that process, will say, hey, yeah, we've got a gap. It's going to be smaller than that raw average gap because you've controlled for other variables, of course. but they're going to probably then say, hey, listen, we need to write this person that $5,000 check to make things right. So that's how most companies are trying to run the process. That said, so they're just different things, right? So legislation in some countries will focus on that first area about just sort of raw differences, and legislation in other companies will say, okay, so show us your process, how you control for variables, and then maybe you're required to prove that you have done so, right? So like there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, but I think people just look at that first way and like sometimes will deny that the problem exists at all because they haven't really taken the time to think through the issue.
Okay.
I love that. That's a great answer. Wait, can I ask we're getting near the end here. I just want to ask a random one. What's your favorite Florida man story?
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Only because I was on your website and you made reference to it. And so I figured you must have one.
Oh my gosh. Well, so I grew up in Tampa. I grew up in, I'm like a multi-generation Floridian. I grew up in Tampa. I spent the first, 25 years of my life there. Proud University of Florida grad, like multi-generation. So, but that said, I live as far away from Florida as possible right now. I live in Portland, Oregon. So, and I used to live in Seattle. And there was some intentionality behind that move. I think there's always, you can like type in your birthday in Florida Man and like brilliant stories will pop up. I grew up in Tampa and it was just like, farmland of professional wrestlers, so like, strangely enough, I like right next to my high school, super common, like almost every day, if I go to the gym after school or whatever, like Hulk Hogan would be in there, Randy Macho Man Savage, yes. All of these like legendary wrestlers, I grew up in like the prime era of wrestling. Like, I went to like the 95 Royal Rumble of the USF Sundome or whatever it was. I was like super into it. So like, a few years later seeing those guys working out, and Randy Savage was in character 100% of the time. Like I grew up in a really conservative household. We were in church every week, and like Doink the Clown was an usher at our church. So like I think just like being around professional wrestlers is like the most Florida thing that I have. But it's a wild state. Every time I go home to see my family, it's always a bit of a shock to the system because I feel like it's just getting weirder. But that's I do miss good Cuban food. Yeah.
In college, my roommates did a lot of like bouncing. They were on the football team. And so when stuff would come to town in Spokane, Washington, they would do these bouncing gigs. And they did the bouncing gig for one of the WWE events that came to town. And then afterwards, the wrestlers went out, and you're 100%. Randy Macho Man Savage afterwards out at the bar that night was like Randy Macho Man Savage. This guy didn't break character for 1 second. It's, yeah, brother. It's like, it was amazing. To watch just from a little bit of a distance, but that's awesome. I love it.
It's a weird place. But I think it develops character and a sense of humor for sure.
I don't know if there's anything else we can say after a good Florida man story. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do, audience. All right, join us in our Facebook group, Win Make Give, facebook.com/group/Win Make Give. We want to know your Florida man story. Right, I think go Google Florida man and your birth date, and let's see what comes up. I think mine, I quickly just looked, and who knows, by the time we post this live, it might be another story. But I think mine was a guy for the second time being arrested, attempting to bring a gun on an airplane because he's a dumbass. All right, so we want you to come in the group. Let us know. Keep the conversation going. We also want you to visit DavidBuckmasterBooks.com, where you can find fair pay. You'll get a lot more than we were able to talk with David about here today. And of course, next time you're going through the Wealth series and we get to increase your income, make sure you come back and check out this episode because it's one that goes along with it. David, we really appreciate you taking the time and joining us, sharing with our audience, educating us, informing us, and helping us guide to make the right decisions when it comes to fair pay and all that includes.
We didn't even get to talk about his cool background. He's got guitars on the wall. Like, I'm jealous of his background. Like,
I know, Bob, and I was cutting you off before you got into the guitar conversation with poor David over there, because who knows where that one's going to go as we're doing Macho Man and Hulk Hogan impersonations here. Folks, until our next episode, as always, do good.